Sorry, I missed the first 45 minutes. Okay. So where were we? I think we just got to the second UGI, haven't we? So all the other domestic markets are perfect. So we talked about, look, if there's market power, that could kind of muck things up. You need to take that into account when you're coming up with your environmental policy. And of course you might say, well, why don't you have the Pigovian tax and then sort out the market power with some other instrument? And of course, in theory that sounds great, but often, just like the Pigovian tax, you can't do if you can't measure the pollution at source. The market power might also be intractable. So even if the Pigovian tax is doable, because you can measure the pollution, maybe you can't deal with the market power for some reason. So then you need to take that into account and try to, it's a lot more complicated, basically. It's what I want to establish for now. And one aspect is, of course, which we mentioned, I think, last Thursday, is distribution. That might be another thing that your Pigovian tax is going to affect. Distribution of income and wealth in the economy over time, and that may also be a concern if you don't have other instruments to deal with that. It could be that you're going to worsen distributional problems which you're not sure how to deal with. Or indeed alleviate distributional problems. So that might be a reason to have raise the Pigovian tax if it's also helping you achieve distributional goals that you don't know how to achieve otherwise. Okay. Then the fourth one is this autarky one that we talked about. And they're both basically the same thing. Either it's an autarky or you've got a global government, effectively, and then the globe is an autarky, right? So without that, there's going to be problems. Pollution is going to cross borders, and even if the pollution doesn't, imposing the tax may affect patterns of international trade, and then, which is going to lead to problems, typically. And then the fourth one is the one we talked about, the very straightforward one, that we can actually measure the flows. The first one that we came up with in class, that we can actually measure the flows and attribute emissions to given agents and then impose the tax on those agents. And of course, for the Pigovian tax to be a UGI, we need to be able to do that costlessly. Okay, if there's any cost associated with doing that, straight away you've got a dilemma, like, okay, is it worth bearing this cost for the benefit of moving towards a better allocation? So, by moving from here to here, we're raising the gap between these two lines by a certain number of dollars per year, aren't we? But if it costs more than that number of dollars per year to administer the system, then it's kind of, okay, maybe we should just let it be. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Or more generally, it's like the costs of the system, there'll be different alternatives which are going to cost different amounts, and maybe something other than a Pigovian tax will be a lot cheaper to implement and get most of these benefits. So, in general, as soon as it's costly to measure the emissions from individual sources and so on, it's like this is opening up the question, okay, is this really the best instrument? Okay. So this is, go back. Yeah, so that's optimal policy in the idealized economy. And if none of these sort of ideals ever hold, well, what's the relevance of the Piagettian tax? And what's the point of environmental economics? Well, I hope you can all see kind of the answers to those questions. So the Piagettian tax is a kind of a baseline for comparison, along with what's our most important baseline for comparison? Oh, it could be, yeah. That's also super important. It wasn't what I was thinking of, but yeah, that's laissez-faire is super important as well. If you think of this, you've got laissez-faire, here we've got the regulator, and this is what we're trying to work out what to tell this guy to do. What's the third one then? Perfect market or the planner's economy, which is the same thing, because the planner will choose to allocate resources perfectly. So yeah, the planned economy or the allocation in the planned economy. Or if we assume that sort of by magic all the markets are perfect, which is the same thing as the planned economy, but through a different mechanism. Yeah, exactly. And the planned economy that's kind of where we want to get to, isn't it? So in a way that's more important than laissez-faire. So laissez-faire is, so like, okay, we know what's happening now, but that doesn't really tell us where we want to go. So the most important, I would say, is like, okay, what's the ideal? And how can we then the question is, how can we get closer to that ideal? And in this UGI economy, then we can do it with a Piagettian tax. But in general, we can't. And it's about dilemmas and trying to find the sort of best alternative out of different alternatives, none of which are perfect, none of which get us all the way to the planned. This allocation in the planner's economy. Because the planner is never going to allocate people to inspections and things. Right? Because the planner is all-knowing, all-powerful. Just knows everything, can just tell people what to do. Doesn't have to spend resources checking things, or in what do you call it, enforcing regulations and so on. You wouldn't have any, in a planned economy, you wouldn't have any police or other inspectors and so on. It wouldn't be needed. Okay. Right. Time for another 15-minute break. I'm exhausted. Thoughts, comments, whatever, before we go on, or should we just go on? Is it kind of clear what? Yeah. Let's see what I've got on the next page. Okay. Why don't I sit down and drink my tea? And you can just spend 2 minutes having a look at that. Okay. Save you having to listen to me the whole time. Just let me know when you got to the end. Eileen's a quick reader. Okay. Yeah. So the idea here is someone sort of comes along to Stefan and says, "Look, Stefan, we've got this big environmental problem," and then Stefan sort of says to Naturvårdsverket or the Swedish EPA, "Look, I can't remember what the director of the Swedish EPA is called." No, I was listening to him about 2 weeks ago, but look, Brian, people are telling me this is a problem and that we need policy, we need to deal with this. Can you look into it? Okay. So imagine that some environmental problem is sort of appearing on the agenda for the first time. How could you imagine tackling it? And so this is a kind of stylized sequence of things that you could imagine doing. Okay. And to me, the logical first thing to do, and by the way, if you look at a sort of research articles that are often sort of built up in this way as well. It's like, okay, here's this problem. As we see it, as we build up the model economy, this is what the planner would do, this is what happens in laissez-faire, this is how you regulate. But that's explaining a model. Now I'm more talking about in reality. So you want to know, Stefan wants to know, or like, how big a problem is this? What are the damages that are being caused? So if you imagine, I mean, you could do this for imagine any problem that suddenly appears on the agenda, like the ozone destruction and CFCs. It's like, okay, some scientist says that the ozone layer is getting destroyed by CFCs. We just discovered this in the 70s, or it seems that this is the case. We need to look at this. Okay. So what are the damages? So typically that's going to involve whatever the environmental economists might say. It's going to involve a lot of natural science. So like, what are the damages from the ozone layer? You know, you're not going to find that out by going to talk to people about how they perceive, you know, trade-off cancer against sunburn, or I don't know. You want to know, like, how much cancer is this causing, or how, you know. And you want to get, in the case of ozone, you need a dynamic model. Yeah. So you want to link the emissions to this over time, to the state of the ozone layer over time, and then to potential damages over time. It's going to be super approximate, right? And then you want to measure the benefit function. What benefit function? Benefits of emitting CFCs. Aren't there any damages?
The emissions come from some sort of consumption that might be positive, or?
Right. So it's this one, isn't it? And this is like, it's the benefits of emitting, what are they? Well, if we're not going to emit, we need to either make less stuff that we like having, or we need to shift to more expensive inputs, etc. Ultimately, we're going to have fewer consumption goods. So we want to know how that looks. So for ozone and CFCs, does anyone have any idea? Like, I've argued, remember the three models from last week? So which one did I say was more, in practice, the one that is most useful for actually understanding problems?
The first one?
I argue that the input model was the best one. That's the one I presented first. It's the one that's presented last in here, if anyone's looked in here. So, if we think of ozone and CFCs, does anyone know, like, how do we deal with CFCs? Does anyone know? Do you know? Any idea? No? Any idea? No? Okay, I just want to check if anyone knows. Basically, so you sort of use CFCs. The whole point about them is that they are sort of neutral. They are very unreactive. They don't really do anything except evaporate easily, kind of. I think that's essentially their role. And that people thought this is great. The scientists thought they're totally unreactive. Nothing happens to them. There are going to be no environmental problems. But because of that, they actually float all the way up to the upper atmosphere, where they are struck by sort of cosmic radiation, so to speak, which then knocks them apart through non-chemical processes. And then you get these free radicals up there, which then destroy the ozone. Nobody thought of that, not surprisingly. So basically, you just need to find something else with the same properties that isn't going to end up in the ozone layer getting knocked apart by free radicals. So it's not rocket science. But the other stuff is just a bit more expensive. Okay. So that is, the benefit function is that essentially you're going to have the same number of fridges, because you use them in the cooling system of fridges, among other things. You're going to have the same number of fridges, but you're going to have slightly more expensive stuff in the cooling system. I don't know if you know how fridges work, but you sort of pump this liquid around and it evaporates and then condenses again. You use that. So that's pretty straightforward. And so then, how do you then find the first best allocation of resources? Yeah.
Is it the system maximization?
Well, again, it's where this is maximized is the allocation of resources that gives you this amount of emissions is the first best allocation. But we can't sort of read off the first best allocation from this model because we've only got emissions. But given the input model and which is giving us where these come from, especially this one, well, and this one actually, we can derive that back to the optimal use of inputs. And remember the one with the gas and the coal. One alternative can be just switching inputs. So that the CFC model is going to be like, it's not going to look like this, is it? it's going to look like this. Okay. Because this is saying what a net benefit, if you get emissions down to zero, what are net benefits in this model? Zero. So what does this say in practice, kind of? With this picture, it's saying you can't produce anything without emitting the pollutant. Okay, there's no clean technology. But for CFCs and many, many other technologies, there are clean technologies. At least as long as you only focus on one pollutant at a time. There are lots of technologies for, cooling stuff in fridges that don't involve any CFCs. So therefore, this is the picture. But in the case of CFCs, this is wrong, yeah. How should I draw it? What does this curve look like for CFCs? Yeah, I've realised what's been missing from this lecture so far. Talk to your neighbour. Alexander, yeah, you have to be Fredrik's neighbour. And Elin can choose her neighbour. So the question is, what's wrong with this picture for CFCs?
What are the axes?
So it's the same, it's tons per year and dollars per year. I'll try and draw it a little bit more carefully.
Yeah. When it's shaped like this would mean that it's moving technologies in general, right? Because as soon as we would use CFC, there would be some pollution. And in this scenario, there is not. So it has to be more general, right? As cooling technology.
I don't know. You mean like the beneficial?
Det är absolut det området jag vill vara.
Ja.
Det är kanske lite för tvärsäkra angreppssiffror egentligen inte kanske vara det. Men
Cooling technology would only rely on CFC.
What's the optimum according to that
If we
picture?
don't have CFC, then we also
Not according to that one.
and also no benefits, right? So
yeah.
this would be like, okay, there are no benefits. We have
So I try to draw it that the slope here is zero, yeah, and then it gradually comes up.
cooling technology there, but I think
And here the slope is positive.
it's just
So we want a point where the slopes are equal then.
trying to understand the graph.
So it should be somewhere here. Let's say the slopes are equal there. And how much, so this is tons per year, yeah? How much CFCs would you emit in laissez-faire according to this? How much CFCs would firms choose to emit in laissez-faire?
Is it where they drop? Or no?
No, like the highest point, right?
It's the highest point, yeah. So you're thinking marginal, you're in
Yeah.
what you've learned thousands of times and taught other students I found out earlier today. But here this is total benefits, yeah.
Okay.
So we're trying to get as high as we can. So, and in laissez-faire, this is ignored, so we're just trying to get as high as we can on this one.
I think this does not direct to your question, but how can it be that we have benefits from the start on? Like, would this mean that the benefits curve refers to cooling technologies in general? Because as soon as we would use CFCs, there would be pollution, right? So then
So which curve are you asking about?
the benefits curve.
Yeah. So I think the thing is to get your head around the units. So if you imagine going this way, okay, then this is the gross benefits to firms of their operation in the sector. And they can maximize those benefits if they're allowed to emit, so to speak, this number of tons of CFCs. So that's what they'll emit in laissez-faire. If you just say, get on with it, no regulations of CFCs at all, they will emit this amount, and the gross benefits to society from their production will be this. Then if you say to them, you're not allowed to emit any CFCs at all, the gross benefits to society, not allowing for the damage side, will go down somewhat, because they'll have to substitute the clean stuff for CFCs, which is more expensive. If you remember the gas case, to the extent that they're just switching one for the other, this part of the curve will actually be a straight line. Because it's like substitute half, substitute 75%, substitute it all. The costs for each bit of substitution are the same. So that's thinking about it going in this direction. So if you think at this point, so this is just, these are the gross benefits in the sort of refrigeration sector when emissions of CFCs are zero. And they are like positive because we can make fridges without any CFCs. And this is the damages from CFCs from the refrigeration sector when there's no emissions of CFCs. Okay. You happy?
Yeah.
So my point with this, I said, what's wrong with this? My kind of answer, the simple answer is, look, the optimum is only getting rid of 40% of the emissions. So then if you say this is a decent picture, you're basically saying we screwed up with our policy, we shouldn't have been getting rid of nearly as much as we did. Whereas in fact it's very clear that the costs of switching CFCs for the alternatives are absolutely trivial compared to the benefits. So instead, as you said, you would expect something more like this, yeah. And it could be, we don't really know much about what curvature this is going to have, but it should definitely be such that this point or something very, very close to it should be the optimum. Really this point, because actually this is just a straight line. We think because we're substituting one thing for another. And then actually, because we've got a stock problem, this is a lot more complicated as well, actually. If you've got a flow problem, then this kind of makes sense, and at a very low levels of the flow, you're going to have very low damages, total damages. I guess it still makes sense in that way, but the whole problem of measuring the marginal damages from emissions are much more complicated when you know this stuff is going to be kicking around for the next 100 years. So to get this curve, you need to actually do calculations about the next couple of 100 years. Because this is about the costs in dollars per year of emitting a ton of CFCs today. But that's the net present value of the costs caused by that ton over its lifetime in the atmosphere. That's what this curve is for a stock pollutant, which is obviously a tricky problem to work out. Oh, sorry, that's kind of the marginal cost, which is the slope of this curve. So in fact, for that kind of stock problem, it does make a lot of sense for this to be a straight line. The reason being that in this, the emissions are absolutely massive. When you're putting the amount differences in emissions and you're putting that into the long context and the fact that there's already a lot of stock there, your emissions in any one year are kind of like a drop in the ocean. So the marginal cost of each unit of emissions is going to be more or less the same. If you didn't get that, don't worry, it's not too important. Okay, so we did this for CFCs, and they did this, of course, in the 80s, or 70s and 80s, and they said, oh look, you know, we shouldn't be, we should be here. And then you can say, well look, in laissez-faire, we're here. That's pretty straightforward. And actually, in this case, we can more or less skip to number 3, and what? Yeah, chat to your neighbour again. What's the policy prescription going to be? We know that we've got this international aspect, so it's super important. We might need a bit of research to come up with better alternatives, or decent alternatives. But that was pretty trivial, actually, to find the alternatives. But we know this is a big deal. So the key difference is, well, in laissez-faire we've got a load of CFCs used. In the planned economy, you would have these alternatives used instead, and no CFCs, according to our picture. So have a think about regulatory instruments then. What are you going to do?
Here's the international aspect again, because we know, okay, the cost of switching is surely just to forbid it. But like,
Jo, men jag menar,
how
vi får
to
väl, tanken är väl att göra allting.
So if you had an autarky,
Alltså, vi ska jämföra hur det var på 70-talet.
it would be like an open and shut case, wouldn't it? Do you understand what I mean by open and shut case? It's like trivial to decide what to do. It's like, oh, here's the case, what should we do? Oh, we know what to do. If it was autarky, either global government or a local, what would you do? You just said it.
just forbid it.
You just forbid it. Like, I mean, the idea of a Pigorian tax would be ridiculous. Now, why would you? It's just a load of administration for nothing. Because so then, as you said, then the dilemma is the international aspect.
But how was it done? Like, was it on UN level or
Eller,
agreements? Or
So this links actually to what I talked about. I can't remember if I talked about this in the course, the other course that he's done, with the EKC stuff, environmental compliance code. Vet du vad det är för något?
Ja.
Yeah, it's
Like
the,
U-shape
yeah,
one,
the
inverted
inverse view,
U-shape.
yeah. So the point is, the tricky thing is that in the rich countries, it might look like this, but in the poor countries, this curve might look like this. It's like, we don't care about a bit of cancer. We want cheap fridges.
Mm.
It's just how it is. Like, if you've got no money, you don't have much willingness to pay for a clean environment either.
Permit.
So therefore,
Men det blir
I mean, one aspect of these international things is just agreeing, not letting anyone be a free rider. But generally, that's not such a problem. The bigger problem is when people, different countries, have different fundamental utility functions, and some countries just don't want. They would prefer a different solution. If everybody basically wants the same solution because they have similar preferences, it's generally not that hard to agree. But when you have countries with different preferences, then it's tricky. And basically what happened with CFCs was that the big countries just have to say, no way of saying, you have to stop emitting this stuff, we're not going to let you carry on.
And it's also depending like where production takes place. Like, or
Potentially, yeah, but that was not such a big deal. I think it's probably spread around. So what did you guys come up with? We've been talking here, so. I can't even remember what the question was. It's like, yeah, how will you regulate this?
You could make it illegal to use CFS, would be the most effective one. Probably most administration costs.
Right. It's like, why would you start imposing taxes or tradable permits or something when you basically just want to get to here? So it's CFCs. Just so you know. Exactly. You're just going to ban them, right? But then there's the international thing. So if there was one global government, the global government, once the science is clear, they're just going to ban this stuff and tell everyone to switch. But what happens in the real world, so to speak? Obviously you need some kind of you need a negotiation, right, of some kind. And as we talked about very briefly, and as we study in my other course on growth and sustainable development, these negotiations tend to be tricky because this may be the rich countries' valuation of the damages. All the countries are going to have a similar benefit curve, okay, because they all basically face similar relative costs for the CFCs and the other stuff you can use instead. The rich countries might value the damages caused by extra cases of cancer and so on very highly. But the poor countries are likely to have much lower valuations, especially if they're much poorer or have much lower incomes. So like, how much, like, there's a concept called I can't remember the acronym for it now, but the statistical value of life, or value of a life. There's an acronym for this. Can't remember. It's basically, okay, the average person's lifespan will be reduced by 1 year if we carry on, in the sort of long run, if we carry on emitting CFCs at the current rate. And then you can convert that using this for each country into an amount of money. And it's based on things like earnings that we talked about before. So in a country where average earnings are 1/20th of those in Sweden, the economists will come up with a value for this that is about 1/20th of the Swedish value. Okay. That might sound grim, but then, well, it is grim. But you could also say, well, what if you ask a Swede, tell a Swede that this is going to give you cancer and reduce a year off your life? What are you willing to pay to make your contribution to get rid of this, and they might say, well, you know, I prefer an economy where everyone was 1,000 crowns or 10,000 crowns a year worse off, but we didn't have this risk. But then if you go to a country where our GDP per year per person on average is 10,000 crowns a year, those guys aren't going to say it's worth 10,000 crowns a year for me to add 1 year to my lifespan from lowering the risk of cancer. That's not the main topic of this course at all, it's quite a way off. But the point is then that different countries are going to have, there's going to be systematically differences in what policies different countries would like to see globally. So basically, unless all the countries are something like this, you're going to have a tricky negotiation. And what you more or less, in the case of CFCs, the bigger, richer economies basically just put their feet down, so to speak, or put their collective foot down and said, no, you have to stop. The countries like India and China, they get an extra 5 or 10 years to wind down their production compared to US, Europe. But they also were basically told, you just have to stop. Okay. This is far from an unusual case. Okay. That the obvious and best thing to do is just ban the stuff. Okay. It's almost perhaps the most common thing. So things get really interesting when it's like, whoa, you know. How do we deal with this? So there's plenty of, or there's a few cases of pollution where it's almost impossible to imagine, or it's really, really tough to see how you're going to get those pollution levels down to zero. I'm wondering, yeah. Have a think. See if you can come up with some pollution problems, or one or two, or one even, where it's like really hard to get to zero. Chat to your neighbour again.
Huh?
You have already done here.
No, both samhälle pollution, I mean, emissions of carbon
Ja, vi
dioxide.
börjar med läsa, men det kommer det också.
I don't know, maybe
Three.
that.
Or
Yeah.
Eller det kan ju räknas med.
I'm just thinking like, okay, maybe that's not
Inte lyst.
I was thinking,
Nej,
I'm not sure if
Däremot-
hydrogen
mer tradition.
is like
Eller
for soil fertility and everything. So
Vad hade du för förslag?
if we have agriculture,
Va?
there needs to be
Koldioxid är
some
ju
extent
inte
of
klart.
fertilizer.
Men en stor del
Because when you
kommer från
harvest, you bring from the soil some
de där grejerna
nutrients
vi
away,
gräver
so they
upp
have
här.
to get back in, and nitrogen
Kan man
easily
få
washes
den
out,
delen
so it
ner?
easily gets into
Ja.
the groundwater. So
Yeah.
I don't know
Det kanske.
if it's
Det är bara liksom en
completely
kostnadsfråga.
like
Så att
that
säga.
nitrate
Byta teknik. Det är
goes
ungefär
down to
samma
the
sak
groundwater.
byta
If this is
till något.
like preventable
Det
at
finns
all, or
alternativ,
is
det
it
finns.
just like reducible?
Det är lite
Because
olika
even
knepigt
though you only
beroende på sektor.
bring
Så
the
för
soil
el,
the amount that
allt
the
som går
plant
på
will need, I
el.
think it
Yeah.
depends on the weather conditions. If
det är
it
liksom
some parts get washed out
jättelätt
or not.
egentligen.
So
Men saker
this
som inte
would
når
be
långt
such a case
i
that
dagens ekonomi.
when you want to have like you want to harvest
Mm,
something
direkt.
or
Yeah.
contain soil fertility,
Mhm.
Alla typer av
that
fordon.
you would always have to be some
Bilar och sånt
some natural
kan gå på el,
pollution
men
in
det
the
är mycket
groundwater.
dyrare
Ja,
jämfört med saker som faktiskt går på fast el. Och så flygplan. Ja, så det är väldigt mångfacetterat koldioxid. Men i de flesta fall så finns det alternativ. Det är olika kostnadslägen och så. Det finns ännu tuffare problem rent konceptuellt än just en koldioxid. I mean, sorry, yeah. I was saying there's even trickier problems than carbon dioxide conceptually. Were you talking carbon dioxide as well?
only for a short while. Then we were talking about
Nitrogen was like this one idea when you want to contain soil fertility to some extent when you also harvest goods, that you have to bring back nitrogen on the fields, but it easily washes out. So even though you just bring out the amount that you harvested, it's still possible that it gets into the groundwater.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I had in mind to talk about. The leaching of fertilizing substances from the soil out to watercourses. It's like incredibly hard to deal with in terms of, like, there's lots we can do, but if you're going to say, like, you know, could we ever get it to zero? It's like, wow. How would you do that? I guess there is an alternative, but it seems such a long way away. So basically, you could say, well, what is zero? You know, even before humans existed, 70,000 years ago and back, humans were like a trivial part of the global ecosystem. From about 70,000 years ago, we started sort of increasing our power over the global ecosystem. 10, 15,000 years ago, we came up with agriculture and the whole thing accelerated. If you think, okay, take it back then, like, even then nitrogen would have been leaching out from soils into the sea, right? So you might say, okay, well, could we get it back down to those levels? But then you had, like, a natural ecosystem, so the whole of Sweden is covered by forest or marshes. The whole of the UK is covered by forest. The whole of Germany is covered by forest. 98% of them, a few marshes in Italy. It's like, how are you ever going to get back to those kind of levels of leaching from those ecosystems? And you've never added any artificial fertilizers. The soils are extremely low, typically, on nutrients and so on. Do you have a thought, how could you ever get, in theory, down to zero leaching?
I think with this number of populations, say it wouldn't work because you couldn't feed everyone when everyone turned back to hunters and gatherers.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Totally right, yeah.
So, yeah, and if you wouldn't allow any leach, so like there's no fertilizers at all, you would also at some point would see a decline in harvest and then a decline in populations at some point because you cannot contain the fertility of the soils.
Yeah. So we definitely have to keep adding fertilizers to soil. And by the way, organic agriculture doesn't help in the slightest.
Did you have some kind of closed system like hydroculture?
That's what I was thinking of. That you would somehow need to recycle. Obviously, you still need this vast scale of agriculture because you just can't, there are physical limits to the sunlight coming in, etc., you can't produce all the food we need in tiny areas. It's never going to happen. But you would need somehow to recycle the water coming out of agricultural fields and make sure it didn't reach water courses. You'd have to sort of collect it and put it back into the field. Somehow you'd have to control the groundwater flows. I'm just thinking, I'm making this up as I go along, but this is the kind of thing I was thinking sooner. Fredrik could probably explain to us why it's totally unrealistic.
Yeah, I don't know. I would think because it's like when you think of it as like there's an artificial ecosystem, it's always in another bigger ecosystem. It's not that we have everything in a greenhouse where we can control everything, and since it's in the natural environment, it's never possible, I would say. When you think of also the scales, when you think there are farms with thousands of hectares, how would you manage to collect all, like, you would need some very efficient drainage system under every field or every hectare of arable land to collect everything. I don't, for me it's like...
Alternatively, you could imagine treating the water at different points in the water courses, as we do today to some extent by what do you call it, like reconditioning or recreating wetlands and things like that. But yeah, the point is it's really, really hard to get emissions down in that case, and that's one example. Like there's plenty of examples where basically it's just like shut down technology, stop doing that stuff. But there's also plenty of examples where it's like, okay, you know. But so, and of course in the former cases it's like, okay, technology standard, just, which is effectively banning something as a technology standard, isn't it? You're not allowed to use this technology. And these kind of cases, it's like, okay, a Pigovian tax could be really good, or something like that kind of economic instrument. Because there's so much we don't know at the firm level. And if all the firms are in the same corner, then it's kind of easier to know. We know that basically all the firms are basically in the same corner, and none of them should be using this stuff, then we just say, no one wants to use it. But if none of the firms are in the corner, or very few, and then we want to tell every firm exactly what to do, that's really tricky. And if the firms are quite different from each other, that's going to cause inefficiency. So then you might say, okay, let's have a Pigovian tax and let the firms choose the optimal portfolio inputs for that firm based on the capital they've got, and etc. But what's the problem with that for nitrogen emissions? It's linked to one of these four, right? There's a massive, massive problem with nitrogen emissions. It's one of those, it's on the board.
So you can't really measure how much is on it.
We don't know who's emitting what to it. How are you going to tax a farmer for nitrogen emissions? It's like, if you were going to do that, you need to be able to measure the nitrogen flowing out of that farm through all those. Fredrik was talking about how to control all those groundwater flows and so on. It's almost the same thing, how you measure the nitrogen in all that groundwater, those ditches and the underground flows.
But yeah, I would assume when you think of, okay, from harvest, like what you really take away, you know, I don't know, for wheat, like how much percentage nitrogen is in there. So you could calculate how much you really take away. And the same goes for the manure or the fertilizers you bring in. And then the difference is
Yeah.
leakage. So I think this would be, I think,
Is the difference leakage?
yeah, there's, I don't know, to some extent I think for what is it, N2O, this would be like, or NH3 I think too, like some is like in gas form where it disappears and
Oh
some
yeah, well
would
that's
go
going to
into
end up in the water
groundwater.
anyway in the end. It's going to rain back down. But the thing is, some of it could be retained in the soil.
Yeah,
quite
this
long
too,
term.
yeah. Okay.
But yeah, it's a very relevant point. Are you following what Frederick's talking about? That in theory you could imagine measuring the nitrogen content of the inputs and measuring the nitrogen content of crops, and then say, oh, the difference must leak out. So then you can imagine taxing farmers on that basis. It's an interesting idea.
I think
I don't know if it's discussed in the literature. It's not really my area. It's certainly not been applied.
since this is also, this is all for my bachelor's, so like some soil classes I had to take, soil science class, but I think then this would also heavily depend on like what fertilizer. For nitrogen, this is rarely really saved in the soil chemically, but phosphorus, phosphorus on the other hand is like much longer in the soil,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Okay. So we're just playing around with some different cases now. So we've got this kind of template for how to analyze problems, but it's going to take us in different directions depending on the problem at hand. Let's take another break. So, I guess not quarter of an hour this time. How long should we have?
5 minutes, maybe?
Yeah. Let's say 7 minutes, or so 37 on the clock there. I'll try and start. So I think we'll just stay on this stuff. So we won't do any problems or anything today. We got some reason my screen has died here. It won't wake up. So what's the point? The point is, well, one point is to go through this, get your head around this process. Like, that's one thing I really want you to get out of this course, is the sort of welfare economist's way of thinking. So environmental economics, typically you could see it as a branch of welfare economics. Yeah. It's like, how do you manage the economy to maximize welfare? That's like mainstream environmental economics. And then it's this sort of social planned economy, laissez-faire, and then the regulator, like give the regulator some levers which hopefully are realistic, and then ask like, okay, what would the regulator choose to do with these levers? So just getting your head around that. Then getting your head around this kind of way of analysing the problem, both in terms of emissions, but also in terms of, okay, choosing from the planner's point of view. The planner is thinking, how shall I allocate resources? What inputs should I tell the firms to use? And then here the regulator is thinking, okay, how can I get close to that allocation? And then that's where the empirics start, because I mean, if you've got this sort of super simple theoretical framework, it's just like, well, you just impose a Piagogian tax and everything's solved. Yeah. But then in reality, we're saying, oh, this could happen, that could happen, the other could happen. And then it's like, okay, which of these will happen, and when, and why, and how do we deal with that? It's really just from case to case, right? So what I had here then was a few cases, but I only managed to write a bit about lead, and then I just had time to jot down a few other ideas. So lead, I get plenty of this I've already talked about. It's another of these cases, a bit like, I can't remember which one it was I was talking about. Yeah, CFCs. So lead's really like CFCs, except that it's a local problem, so it's a lot simpler. Because basically you emit the lead to the air, someone else breathes it in within, I don't know the science, but within a few days, I guess. Otherwise it's going to end up on the ground, in the water, whatever, and we're assuming that the big damage is when you breathe it in. So it's basically a local problem and it's a flow problem. You're not too worried about the stock of lead out there. So that makes it a lot simpler. On the benefit side, or the costs of abatement, you're basically in this kind of situation with a straight line. It's basically you just cut the amount of lead you put in the petrol until you get it to zero. And that's going to give you a more or less straight line increase in costs. Because basically you need more petrol to get your car a certain distance if there isn't lead in it. In practice it means retuning the engines and things, but slightly, you can't just suddenly start putting lead into a car or stop putting lead in, you need to sort of, but once you've done that, this is the effect. So it's a super straightforward problem. So actually the big stumbling block really, because we only got around to banning this stuff in like the 80s and 90s. And we've been adding lead to petrol since the 20s. And this lead was causing measurable brain damage to our kids since a long time back. So why the delay? I guess two things. One is that our income was increasing the whole time, so effectively this curve is getting steeper because we're valuing that more and more highly over time. We're valuing our kids' development more highly in monetary terms, whereas the monetary cost of switching fuel types is staying the same. The other thing is just the information that as long as the scientific evidence could be questioned, then the sort of the motor organizations and the whatever, their lobbying could keep this in check, so to speak. But as the scientific evidence built up, then it became like impossible to carry on arguing for you doing this. And sort of one of the things that was claimed was that, look, we know that lead causes brain damage, but the effect is more so like this, okay. So up to a certain point, it doesn't cause any damage, and then the damage kicks in. Because like up to a point, say, the argument might be that the body can deal with this up to a point, and then it gets too much. But then gradually the evidence starts to emerge that, look, this stuff is doing damage. Every molecule of lead in your bloodstream is doing damage. And the more molecules, the more damage. So once you've established that, and you've got enough income, it's basically a no-brainer. And of course, for a while, in, I guess you all know vaguely who Margaret Thatcher was. Beloved by some, leader of the UK in the 80s. She was really keen on sort of economics, and she loved these economic theories. She had this sort of monetarist theory about how to manage the economy as a whole. And she thought, okay, let's tax lead in petrol. But nothing really happened. I mean, there was a certain decrease. But it's like, okay, so if I pay a bit of tax, it's okay for me to give your kids brain damage. It's like, nah. Pretty quickly, everyone realized, look, this is crazy, just ban stuff. Okay, so that's like a pretty straightforward case, where there aren't really, in a way you could argue it's a UGI, that it's like a perfect case for Pigou, but the damages are so great compared to the benefits that it's unthinkable to let anybody do this, even if they wanted to. So then nitrogen and phosphorus leakage from agriculture. So there, we've talked about that. The big problem there is what we call NPS pollution. NPS stands for non-point source. Okay. So the idea of a point source is that it's this huge factory or whatever, and we can actually, there's few enough points that we can actually go in and measure emissions and charge them based on that. With non-point source, you've got this huge dilemma, like how do we deal with this? How do we apply the tax? If the emissions are linked to the use of a certain input, and if they're very quite linearly or very strongly linked in a simple way, then you can tax the input. That's the sort of simplest way. So what could you imagine taxing in the case of agriculture? Used to be done in Sweden.
Could you tax acres? Or how many square meters do you?
Okay, yeah, you could do. There is kind of a link. But then someone's got to make the food, haven't they? Wow. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. But wow, that would be a very blunt instrument, wouldn't it? There's an idea that's closer to this. And in a way, I mean, the acres are an input to agriculture, of course, but the idea I've got sounds kind of logical, but so where are these nitrogen emissions and phosphorus emissions? Where do they sort of come from ultimately?
Tax the fertilizer, I
You
guess?
could tax the fertilizer inputs.
And how people are using it more efficiently instead.
Exactly.
Training.
The problem is that there's the link between the amount of fertilizer you put on and the amount that leaches out is not very strong at all. It depends hugely on what you do on the field. And like Beatrix said, hopefully most of the fertilizer is going into the food, and just a small proportion is leaking out. And so the link between fertilizer use and leaching is not very strong. But they used to tax fertilizer inputs in Sweden, and they gave the revenue to SLU. So that was a bit of a shame when they stopped that about 15 or 20 years ago. Okay, but that's an example of a non-point source, and that's a really big problem in general, this kind of typical problem number 4 in our list, wasn't it? So identifying who's emitting. What about, so this is just a sort of an axe block, just a few random examples of big pollution problems, kind of sulfur dioxide emissions from combustion. So where does sulfur dioxide emissions to the air come from? Well, the clue's in the in the question. What's combustion? Anyone, what does that word mean? Do you know? Burning stuff. Okay. And in particular, burning actually one thing in particular, especially. Coal. Yeah. The big one is coal. Fuel oil also, like unrefined oil, also has sulfur emissions. So the kind of stuff you use to run ships. So actually, typically, it's not that hard to identify the emitters. And at least in the past, it was definitely a kind of a toss-up kind of case, where there wasn't a strong argument for going all the way over here and saying, look, nobody's allowed to emit any sulfur dioxide. There's a big international aspect, like that picture I showed you. So that makes things tricky. How do you actually cut the sulfur dioxide emissions? Does anyone know? Any thoughts? Again, I need to know this, so you don't really. I guess since it's coal, you must be able to work out, like if you're using coal to generate electricity, it's not that hard. Like obviously, I mean, you can use something else, right? So actually, since we're on Thatcher, Thatcher got rid of coal in the UK and replaced it with gas, more or less. And sulfur dioxide emissions fell drastically, much to the pleasure of the Germans and Swedes, among others. There's another thing you can do, which is to put a scrubber onto the chimney. And in places like, you can basically put a sort of limestone thing on the chimney and absorb the sulfur dioxide before it gets into the air. So, if we think of our sequence, it's like, I was thinking of this. We could go up to it. Oh. So damages and benefits, we're assuming they're kind of in between. So first best involves quite a big reduction in emissions, but not total stop. And there's alternative technologies. We can put a scrubber on, or we can close the coal-fired power stations and have gas. How are you going to achieve that in the best way? So you can imagine different alternatives, right? You could imagine saying to all the coal-fired power stations, you could imagine saying you all have to have this cleaning technology. Or you could imagine saying, oh, we're not going to have any more coal, you have to switch to gas. Or you could imagine saying, we going to measure your emissions, and you're going to have to pay tax. And then the firms themselves will choose, given that tax, we'll put the scrubber on, or we'll switch to gas. Typically, what the environmental economist is going to argue for. We're running out of time, but typically the environmental economist would argue for the tax, right? But it's not always that obvious. But in the US, they basically went with the tax. It's called the Clean Air Act, although in fact it was tradable permits rather than a tax. In Europe, they went for more what environmental economists call command and control. It basically said, you all have to put scrubbers on. Or, in a way, what Thatcher did was to take away the subsidies to coal, and at the same time, the North Sea oil industry got going, and there was this flood of cheap gas, which is like a byproduct of oil production. So the coal-fired power stations basically disappeared due to market forces, you could say.
A bit off topic, but was this the reason for this huge strikes in the 80s in the UK?
Yeah. So that was more like British coal. So the British coal industry is like digging deep tunnels and hacking away at these tiny seams way underground, was massively subsidized. Basically by the power stations, which were, I guess, were government run. Yeah, they were basically government run, and they were sort of mandated to buy British coal, even though like the stuff from other places was available much more cheaply. And Thatcher put a stop to that, which basically involved closing the whole coal industry. And that was a massive conflict. Okay. So this is like a super interesting kind of test case where it's like, an economist would claim, most economists would claim that the US system has had huge benefits in terms of achieving stuff more cheaply. CFCs, you just ban them. And then what we're going to talk about a lot in the course as we get on is climate. Okay, we're out of time. What a shame. Basically, climate has everything. Okay. It has absolutely everything. You've got massive information problems about, like, what's the damage function, what's the benefit function. You've got point sources, you've got non-point sources. You've got international negotiations. Any difficulty you can basically imagine is there in the climate problem, and most of them are big and important. It's not like, oh yeah, but that's only a small proportion, or Yeah, you've also got a huge need for research and investment in knowledge, and then you've got the whole knowledge spillover thing. So how do you deal with that? Okay. So a super interesting problem. I'm requiring basically a portfolio of different actions from a regulator. There's not just like Pigovian tax for climate. So we'll talk about that. Plenty. Okay. So, let me see if I can got nothing on my screen here, unfortunately. So we need a bit of a plan, right? So, yeah, we're over time. Is everyone okay for like another 2 minutes? Or are you okay? Yeah. So I'm just thinking about, so tomorrow we'll have a look at the problems, okay? And we'll talk about some of the problems.
Do you know which ones or all of them?
We'll start from the top.
Okay.
And yeah, it would be really helpful if everyone could have looked at the. I mean, it's tight on the timings, but where are we? Yeah. So what have we got? Yeah, so effectively here we've got the perfect markets, and then we've got examples of trouble, kind of. Market power is one example, non-uniformly mixing, cumulative pollutants is another, uncertainty is another, yeah, and then the international aspects is another. So in a way, all those different subsections apart from the first one are kind of equivalent. So I guess what we'll do is talk about a selection of these problems in terms of how they're set up and what they're really about and relating them. And then we'll go on to looking at climate policy. And then I've decided on some literature. So then if we look at problems on tomorrow, and then we could almost go, I think, on to looking at some climate policy stuff on Thursday. And then we can come back to problems later, I guess. Does that make sense, do you think?
The climate topics, they then relate more to the project?
Yeah, so then the project is going to be that I want you guys to focus on one particular empirical problem. So not the whole of climate policy, but it could be an aspect of climate policy. Or some other sector, some other pollutant. And discuss it based on literature and based on the kind of methodology we've talked about. Okay, Janina wants to go,
Yes,
and
I
that's
gotta
quite...
go.
No, don't be sorry. I'm sorry for going over time, but we should stop there. So tomorrow we'll basically be focusing on looking at the problems. That's the short answer. And I should be able to, by tomorrow I'll have information up about the climate part, what papers we're going to look at and so on. I really don't want to leave this computer like this. Like the next person is going to be totally screwed. desktop.
What if you choose extend, like in this option multiple displays, and then on the
Okay, it seems to be working now. I think. But what was your suggestion? To go extend. See.
yeah. So I don't know if this has two display.
So then it just seems to. Then nothing comes up on the.
Okay. But do you want this mirrored or?
Yeah. So then that shows duplicate, but then it kind of screws
See you
up.
tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Then, I don't know.
Nah. Whatever.
One other question. You mentioned, I don't know, 2 lectures ago that you're now Swedish citizen.
Yeah.
Does this mean that you have to also give up your British one, or do you have
No.
now 2?
Yeah, I have to.
This would be like a big price to pay for.
Yeah. I thought about just giving up my British one anyway,
Oh,
because I'm so fed up with the British. But it, of course it would be crazy.
okay.
Like,
Why does it cost